They had the world in the palm of their hand. Absolute power, untouchable status, and a mountain of money that defied gravity itself. Billions. And then, in the blink of an eye, it all turned to dust. Literally. Their names were dragged through the mud. Their financial empires, the pillars of the global economy, collapsed without a trace. The magnates vanished. They evaporated. The official version: total loss, bankruptcy, an accidental death at sea, or a deal that went sideways. But what if all this ruin, all this public destruction, was never an accident? What if the fall was just the perfect disguise? Case 1. Robert Maxwell, the media tycoon who vanished at sea. In 1991, the name Robert Maxwell was not merely synonymous with wealth, but with editorial and political power at the highest echelons of Europe. This was no ordinary billionaire. Maxwell was a force of nature, a man of imposing physical stature and unbridled ambition, a giant who controlled a transnational media empire that included Macmillan Publishers, the Mirror Group newspapers, with influential titles like the Daily Mirror, and a host of technology and communications companies. Maxwell's holding company was a financial labyrinth that stretched across the European continent, a web of influence that granted him access to prime ministers, heads of state, and the most closely guarded secrets of the establishment. He was the archetype of the magnate, loud, self-confident, and above all, perceived as untouchable. The very journalism he controlled painted him as a self-made hero, a World War II survivor who rose from humble origins to become a global titan. The world bent to his will, or so it seemed. However, Robert Maxwell's greatness was, like so many things in the lives of billionaires, merely the facade. Beneath the veneer of success and public displays, including his superyacht, the Lady Ghislaine, the foundations of his empire were rotten. Rumors about his financial conduct and dubious management practices were persistent. But his influence was so vast that the major press, controlled or intimidated by him, preferred silence. His insatiable ambition demanded a constant flow of capital, and he had found a perverse and ingenious way to secure this financing without resorting to traditional loans or external investors. He was stealing. The mechanism was of a staggering audacity. Through a complex and secretive scheme, Maxwell had been systematically siphoning off hundreds of millions of pounds from the employee pension funds of the Mirror Group and other companies in his conglomerate. For the workers who dedicated their lives to his newspapers, their future was guaranteed by those savings. For Maxwell, that money was a personal war chest, used to prop up the stock price of his debt-ridden companies, and more cynically to finance his Nabobesque lifestyle. It was a house of cards built on trust and held up by fear and absolute power. In November 1991, the castle was about to crumble. External auditors were beginning to sniff out the fraudulent accounting. Internal investigations were narrowing. The fall was inevitable, and public exposure would mean not only financial ruin, but total disgrace, likely culminating in decades in prison and the complete destruction of his family legacy. It was at this moment of maximum desperation that Maxwell's narrative took a fatal and unfathomable turn. In the early hours of November 5, 1991, the mega-yacht Lady Ghislaine, named after one of his daughters, who would later become infamously known, was sailing off the Canary Islands. Robert Maxwell was aboard. These were his last recorded public hours. Daybreak arrived with the crew discovering his absence. Maxwell, the man who always demanded attention, had vanished without a trace. Hours later, his body was found floating in the Atlantic Ocean. The official verdict was swift but permanently questioned: accidental death caused by a fall from the yacht. The giant had fallen into the sea. However, the outlines of the case were too strange to be accepted. Maxwell was a man bordering on paranoia about security, and the idea of an unhappy, solitary stumble in the middle of the night seemed improbable to those who knew his temperament. Furthermore, autopsies were never entirely conclusive, with some arguing the thesis of suicide out of desperation and others pointing to the possibility of homicide. He had many enemies in the world of politics and intelligence services. But what cemented the mystery and brings us to this story is not the cause of his death, but what happened immediately afterwards. Maxwell's death acted as an alarm, triggering the collapse of his empire. The secrecy vanished. It was then that investigators and terrified former employees discovered the scale of the fraud. $1.5 billion had vanished from the pension funds. The money meant to sustain the old age of thousands of people had been plundered. Robert Maxwell's death conveniently served as the dramatic endpoint to a scandal that would have otherwise dragged through the courts for years, exposing the magnate's shadowy connections. The body was found, the culprit was dead, and the case was closed. The billions, they truly disappeared. Herein lies the core of the conspiracy that survives to this day. Maxwell was known to have deep ties to the Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service, and other intelligence agencies, for whom he allegedly provided privileged information and technology. Could a man with so many secrets, so much bargaining power, and access to impenetrable offshore networks have genuinely drowned by accident? Or was his staged disappearance, perhaps with the aid of third parties interested in silencing or protecting him, the perfect way to wipe the slate clean, escape justice, and crucially ensure that a significant portion of the stolen billions remained permanently hidden? Many believe that Robert Maxwell did not drown. He merely swapped the Lady Ghislaine for a new life, far from the headlines and prisons, enjoying his stolen fortune in some unknown tax haven. The media magnate vanished at sea, but the ghost of his lost fortune and the question of his final destiny continue to haunt the Atlantic Ocean and the archives of criminal and conspiratorial history. Case 2. Alan Stanford, the cricket king of lies. If Robert Maxwell was the old guard, Alan Stanford was the epitome of the new millennium's fraud. More glamour, more sunshine, and a touch of hypocritical charity. In the early 2000s, Stanford was the image of financial success across the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. A Texas native, he built the Stanford Financial Group, a company headquartered on the island of Antigua, which quickly became an unavoidable name in the world of investment and, more extravagantly, in global sports sponsorship. Stanford wasn't just rich, he bought legitimacy. He was known as Sir Alan, a dubious honorary title granted by the island of Antigua, and lived life at the highest volume. State-of-the-art private jets, fortress-like mansions, and, crucially, the obsessive patronage of major cricket events. This sport, immensely popular across the Commonwealth, was his perfect vehicle. He poured hundreds of millions of dollars into it, created high-stakes tournaments, and even became the face of the Stanford Super Series, famously landing a helicopter on the pitch at Lord's Cricket Ground in London to hand over $1 million check. He met with presidents and prime ministers, was photographed with sports stars and Hollywood figures, and the press described him as a visionary who had transformed Antigua into a financial hub. Public trust in his paper empire was therefore armored by the golden sheen and social prestige he financed. But just as in Maxwell's case, the splendor was a monumental smokescreen. Behind the immaculate white shirts and gold trophies, the Stanford Financial Group was a gigantic, fraudulent Ponzi scheme. His primary tool for raising money was the high-yield certificates of deposit, CDs, sold by his Stanford International Bank in Antigua. These CDs promised consistently high, above-market returns, a classic red flag, but one that was ignored due to the shine of the Stanford name. The promise was simple. Your money was safe and would grow exponentially. The reality, discovered years later by the SEC, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, was that new investor money was being used to pay the fake profits of old investors, maintaining the illusion of success. Worse, large chunks of the capital were siphoned off to fund Stanford's opulent lifestyle and the sports initiatives that served only as a marketing facade. The charade began to collapse dramatically in 2009. The 2008 financial crisis had shaken the market, and Stanford's promise of unshakable stability began to look ridiculous. When an increasing number of investors attempted to withdraw their funds, the machine ground to a halt. In February 2009, the empire was raided. The fraud that came to light surpassed in scale many of history's greatest financial swindles. It is estimated that Stanford siphoned off approximately $7 billion from over 30,000 investors across 113 countries. The collapse was immediate and violent. Funds dried up, accounts were frozen, and Stanford was arrested. The king of cricket was tried and sentenced to 110 years in prison. For the world, the story was closed. The swindler was behind bars. But here enters the mystery that echoes Maxwell's case. Where is the money? During the trial and the subsequent global search for assets, the liquidators and insolvency investigators made a frustrating discovery. Most of the $7 billion was never recovered. A large portion of the fortune had been skillfully buried in highly complex offshore accounts, routed through Swiss banks, Pacific Islands, and shell companies in Central America. The very structure of his Antigua bank was designed to obscure and conceal, not to invest. The question persists. If Alan Stanford was convicted and is serving a sentence that is, in effect, lifelong, why did the money trail grow cold so efficiently? Did he act alone? Or did his conviction serve merely as a scapegoat to protect a larger network of accomplices and facilitators who, following his incarceration, took control of the hidden fortunes? The nature of Stanford's Ponzi scheme was to feed his own ego, but the sheer volume and complexity of the transfers suggest a highly sophisticated team of money laundering experts. While Stanford rots in prison, the real wealth remains untouched, buried somewhere in the financial underworld he so cleverly manipulated. The public saw the collapse, the trial, and the conviction. But the most important outcome, the recovery of the fortunes, never materialized. Alan Stanford lost his freedom, but his master plan may have ensured that the money, which he considered his own, would never be returned. The ruin was real for the investors. For the money, it was merely a move to secure its new identity. The $7 billion fortune is still out there, patiently waiting beneath the fog of secrecy. Case 3. Patok Chodiev and the Kazakh Triad, the Vanished Billionaires. The case of the Kazakh Triad, comprising Patok Chodiev, Alijan Ibragimov, and Alexander Mashkevich, is fundamentally different from the stories of Maxwell and Stanford. Here, it is not merely about a single massive fraud or a mysterious death, but rather a perfect engineering of asset disappearance coordinated by a group of individuals with deep ties to state power on a truly global scale. The history of this triad begins with the collapse of the Soviet Union, a moment of chaos and mass privatization that served as the largest and fastest generator of illicit fortunes in modern history. These three businessmen, with origins in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan but active in Kazakhstan, rose meteorically to control vast natural resources, notably chrome ore, alumina, and natural gas. Their holding company, the Eurasian Natural Resources Corporation, ENRC, became a mining giant listed on the London Stock Exchange, accumulating a market value of several $billion in just a few years. Their ascent was proof that, in the new Kazakhstan, the key to wealth was not innovation, but access. And they had the access. They were seen as the godfathers of the post-Soviet economic boom. However, this boom came inseparably linked to allegations of systemic corruption, bribery, money laundering, and questionable ties to high-ranking political figures. ENRC's operations rapidly spread across Africa and other jurisdictions, but their methods were often scrutinized. Investigative journalists and law enforcement agencies in Europe and the US began to trace a pattern of shadowy deals payments to mysterious intermediaries and the creation of a network of shell companies and offshore accounts that seemed to have the sole purpose of moving money invisibly. The major turning point occurred in Europe, where the triad had established their base and sought legitimacy. They were targeted by complex investigations in Belgium over suspicions of money laundering and corruption involving the sale of helicopters and other assets in Kazakhstan. The legal and public pressure was mounting. The risk was not just a fine, but the potential freezing of all their assets and the destruction of their financial reputation in the Western sphere, which would mean the loss of their global influence. The Kazakh Triad's reaction is what makes this story a model of faked ruin in real time. Instead of facing the charges or allowing their empire to be dismantled by the courts, they initiated a series of financial and corporate moves that rendered their fortune legally unattainable. ENRC was taken private and delisted from the London Stock Exchange in 2013, a move that, on the surface, appeared to be a response to tighter regulations and excessive public scrutiny. In reality, it was an act of strategic self-cannibalization. By going private again, the triad removed themselves from the mandatory scrutiny of the capital market and British transparency rules. This allowed them to reorganize their assets at staggering speed. The money did not disappear abruptly, as in a Ponzi scheme. It was meticulously relocated. Bank accounts in high-secrecy jurisdictions were emptied, shell companies in the British Virgin Islands, Cyprus, and Luxembourg were dissolved or had their ownership altered, and complex trust structures were activated to transfer the wealth to new names and entities often linked to family members and trusted associates. The ruin the triad orchestrated was not their own. It was the ruin of transparency. Instead of losing their fortunes in a financial implosion, they rendered them invisible to the eyes of international law. They offered their public empire as a ritual sacrifice to protect their true net worth. Belgian and British authorities faced a bureaucratic nightmare, chasing money trails that vanished into the world's deepest offshore labyrinth. The hunt for these assets became a costly and largely unfruitful legal battle. With their assets out of reach and the corporate shell structures closed, the three billionaires discreetly announced their retirement. Patok Chodiev, Alijan Ibragimov, and Alexander Mashkevich did not go to prison. They simply retreated to their multiple private estates across different continents. Years later, traces of their wealth reappeared. New investments in different sectors, new luxury properties in Paris and London, all under the umbrella of new companies and new corporate names, but financed by the same billions that were never recovered. The moral of this chapter is grim. When you have enough power, you don't need to fake a death. You only need to fake the loss of jurisdiction. The Kazakh triad demonstrated that the true art of hiding wealth is not outright theft, but rather building a system that, at the moment of crisis, can repackage and relabel billions of dollars, making the vanished money permanently unreachable for those with the legal right to it. They did not just vanish, they rewrote the rules of where money exists. Case 4. Igor Kesayev, the tycoon who burned his empire. The story of Igor Kesayev is the latest and most directly influenced by geopolitical warfare and sanctions. His case doesn't involve classic fraud or a physical disappearance, but rather a sophisticated controlled implosion and a corporate re-engineering under enemy fire. Kesayev, one of Russia's most discreet and therefore most dangerous oligarchs, built an empire based on two essential pillars: tobacco and weapons. He was the main shareholder of the Mercury Group, a conglomerate that owned the gigantic Megapolis distributor, Russia's largest tobacco distributor, and one of Eastern Europe's biggest, and the Dictators plant, one of the country's oldest and most important arms manufacturers, supplying heavy weaponry to the Kremlin. This duality, mass consumer goods and cutting-edge military technology, granted him a unique position of power and influence with the Russian government. Behind the scenes, Kesayev operated as a key mediator between state power and private capital, accumulating a fortune that placed him among Russia's wealthiest men. His wealth was undeniable, but his control structure was deliberately opaque, a standard requirement for oligarchs serving the state in sensitive sectors. The chessboard shifted dramatically in 2022. With the intensification of the conflict in Ukraine, the West imposed an unprecedented cascade of economic sanctions, aiming to financially strangle the Russian elite and, in particular, those linked to the military-industrial complex. Kesayev, given his direct connection to arms production, was a priority target. The inclusion of his name on sanctions lists meant corporate death in the West, asset freezes, travel bans, and the immediate severing of all international banking and commercial relations. Anyone less prepared would have seen their empire crumble under the overwhelming weight of these restrictions. But Igor Kesayev and many other oligarchs of his ilk were not disarmed. What followed was not a loss, but a meticulously planned burning of documents and assets. The ruin the world saw was, in fact, a controlled fire with the sole purpose of protecting the real wealth and, more importantly, keeping essential operations functioning. The strategy involved two phases. The first, the public implosion phase, was designed to meet the demands of the sanctions. Kesayev's companies began to be dissolved on paper. Large shareholdings were quickly restructured. Megapolis, the pillar of his wealth, was subjected to complex maneuvers. In official records, businesses appeared to be suffering catastrophic losses, with billions being written off or devalued. This staging created the narrative that the oligarch was being severely hit by sanctions, leading many to believe that his influence and power were diminishing. To the West, Kesayev was a weakened enemy. The second phase, the secret reincarnation, revealed the true plan. Kesayev's most valuable assets and income streams did not disappear. They were transferred to a new corporate architecture, protected behind a legal smokescreen. The most common method for this transfer was the use of direct family members, typically daughters, as new front owners. Suddenly, billion-dollar fortunes appeared in the records in the hands of young people with no apparent experience in the tobacco or arms sectors, but with perfect family and trust ties. This maneuver is known as sanction proofing. The money remains within the family's sphere of control, but legal ownership is altered, making it much harder for Western governments to freeze assets without affecting citizens who are technically not sanctioned. The ruin of Kesayev's empire was, therefore, a metamorphosis. Money that seemed lost in annual reports reappeared in discreet but secure investments in jurisdictions that did not adhere to the sanctions. Warehouses that emptied were refilled under new brands. The tobacco distribution system continued to operate, generating the cash flow that feeds the oligarch's wealth, now just harder to trace. The question that concludes Kesayev's case is perhaps the most cynical of all. Was it a loss or a rebirth? The answer is clear for those familiar with the maneuvers of the Russian financial underworld. It was a survival maneuver. The magnate did not lose his fortune. He hid it in plain sight, sacrificing Western corporate legitimacy in exchange for the total protection of his billions and the continuity of his essential businesses. The burning of the empire was the clearing of the board, allowing the wealth to resurface, stronger and more inaccessible than ever, under a new name and a new facade of apparent innocence. He didn't just fool the auditors. He fooled an entire system of international sanctions, proving that, for the most powerful, ruin is just a tool. Robert Maxwell, Alan Stanford, the Kazakh triad, Igor Kesayev. 4 names, 4 continents, different stories. But if you look closely, the pattern is frighteningly the same. They didn't just go broke. They actively rewrote financial reality itself. What the press called a collapse, and what the courts called a loss, we have uncovered to be the biggest corporate illusionist's trick. Think about it. In a world where wealth is synonymous with power and visibility attracts scrutiny, ruin is the perfect disguise. The public downfall of a billionaire serves a double purpose. It distracts the authorities, focusing them on the person while the money sneaks into the shadows, and it signals to the world that the problem is solved. But Maxwell's billions remain missing offshore. Most of Stanford's $7 billion was never recovered. The Kazakh oligarchs vanished into luxury retirement, and Kesayev's empire simply swapped owners on paper. Empires can be burned, fortunes can be declared lost. But the fundamental truth is that money never evaporates. It only changes hands, or more dangerously, changes jurisdiction. That is what the truly wealthy understand. They never disappear. They simply become untouchable. What about you? What would you do to keep your fortune secret? Would you fake your own ruin to escape sanctions or justice? Leave your honest comment below. We want to know your opinion. If this dark investigation has opened your eyes to the underworld of the richest, please like this video and subscribe to the channel to ensure you do not miss the next Hidden Files. Hit the bell icon so we can reveal more financial secrets together here on the Hidden Fortunes Files.